Hi everybody. It's great to have such a great crowd here on our last Curtain Corner for the year. As you know, we sometimes have these Curtain Corners in person, very rarely these days, but today we've got one, so it's great to have a good crowd. So welcome everybody. My name is John Phillimore. I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy here at Curtin, and it's great to have you here at Curtain Corner. Many of you I know are Curtain Corner regulars, both online and when we have them in person. So welcome back to you guys, and anybody who's new and never been, hi. Great to have you here and come again. Okay, so thanks very much. And of course I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. So, in case you haven't been to a Curtain Corner before, we have been doing this now for I think 20 years. It's a long time on a Friday afternoon. So we always have to compete with the cricket or the beach or the weather, but we do it, through rain or shine. So today we're competing with the cricket, and Michael's obviously a big attraction because he's got people here, and I don't want to see anybody looking at their phone to check out the cricket score. Okay, you've got to wait, just got to wait an hour. So we've been doing this for about 20 years, and in recent years, as I said, ever since COVID, we went online, but over the last couple of years, I've decided to try and bring back the vibe by having some in-person talk. So when Michael suggested that he would be in Perth and would like to do a talk, I said, terrific, let's do it here. And it's a great way to finish the year off. So it's a welcome change. However, we are recording the session, so those people who might be watching the recording, we will be uploading it to our website soon. It usually takes about a week. So if you do have colleagues who couldn't come today and you want them to have a look at it, tell them to go onto our website and see the presentation again. And we have all of our talks from this year and from previous years up on our website. In fact, I sent an email out, I think about a week ago, with some of the individual YouTube videos for some of our talks over the last few weeks. So I recommend you go and look at those. So the format for today is that Michael will speak, I don't know, we think 20, 25 minutes or something like that in a sort of more formal way, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation, which is a little bit different from how we usually do things. So I'm going to be like Sarah Ferguson on 7:30, grilling him with tough questions. No, much more like a podcast, having a conversation. And then after that, we'll sort of open it up to questions and answers. As you can see, I mean, those of you not been here before, it's like a bit like the United Nations here. Michael might talk about the UN. It's a little bit UN-ish. You've got these little microphones in front of you, and if you ask a question, we'll ask you to please press the button, use the microphone, and then press the button to turn it off, because that way in the recording we'll be able to hear your question much better. Okay. Afterwards, after we finish the Q&A, we'll be going out into the foyer where we have some refreshments, continue the conversation more informally, and even more importantly, you can buy a copy of Michael's book. I've got a copy. I've already read mine from, I had it a little while back, and I've been told there's a new chapter. So there's a new paperback version out, so if I might need to buy a new one to read the new chapter. But there's copies out there which you can buy courtesy of Boffin's Books. So please get your purchasing ready, and Michael will probably sign a copy or two. So now I'd like to formally introduce Michael Sheldrick, who's a policy entrepreneur, a driving force behind the efforts of Global Citizen to end extreme poverty. He was a co-founder and he's also the Chief Policy, Impact and Government Affairs Officer at Global Citizen, and I'm sure he'll tell you all about what that organisation does. And he's worked... We had a conversation this morning at our work about what's the most famous person you've ever met or who you've talked to. Well, Michael would win this hands down because he's worked with international artists such as Beyonce, Coldplay, Lady Gaga, Miley Cyrus and Rihanna, so he's way ahead of us already, as well as political leaders including Justin Trudeau, former Canadian Prime Minister, the Barbados Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, Ban Ki-moon, former UN Secretary General, and of course Australian Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And he's produced several impactful social campaigns and events, which he'll explain a little bit more about in his talk today. So he's a notable speaker and author on policy advocacy, sustainable development, corporate responsibility, and he's shared these insights at conferences and summits worldwide, and I'm pretty sure he's only just come back from one in Brazil, correct? He's just been to Brazil. So Michael graduated from the University of Western Australia with a law and arts degree, and I first met him about 15 years ago, I think. So he was Young West Australian of the Year in 2013 for his campaign. He work as a community activist and a social justice campaigner. So from that beginning, he's strutted the world stage, campaigning and being very active, and it's great to have him here at Curtin University. So Michael, over to you. And there's your little clicker. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks, John, for hosting us, and really grateful to be here at Curtin University. Part of the reason why I'm back here is my wife, Wendy, who's at the back taking photos because she's great at that, but she's great at many things, and she, you know, it's funny, when her and I got married, she didn't really know where Perth, Western Australia was, and many people don't in New York City. And often what I tell people when they say, where are you from, Sydney or Melbourne? And I say, Perth, Western Australia. And they say, where's that? I say, pretty much if you were to drill a hole through the ground, through the core of the earth, you would come out the other side on the coast of where I grew up in Perth, Western Australia. And the reason why I tell that story is we have a 2-year-old daughter now, and my parents, much to their chagrin, said, why did you choose the furthest point on the map to have our grandchildren? So I made a promise that we would come back to Perth at least once a year, and what better time than to come for December than here in Christmas. And I can tell you, I was just speaking to one of my colleagues in New York a few hours ago, and here he was all filled up with a great big coat, dark outside, and we were down at Mounts Bay Road at the Old Swan Brewery, and I just turned around and said, here's our office for the day. And so it's a special place being back here in Western Australia. I also just want to thank some friends and guests who have turned out. My good friend David Gonsalves, who's just been appointed the Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Perth, and he actually cut his teeth in politics in this very chamber about a decade and a half ago. So appreciate David. In fact, two decades ago. There you go. Okay. Older than I thought. And sat next to him is Colleen, who has just arrived as the new US Consul General as well. So really appreciate you coming here. And I was saying our daughter, at least, is one of your constituents. So appreciate you coming down. And thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Friday evening. Myself, growing up here in Western Australia, how did I get involved in Global Citizen? Well, it all began really a couple of decades ago. I was growing up here in the northern suburbs of Perth, and you know, at the time when I was growing up, I was one of those kids. I wasn't good at sports. I wasn't good academically. I struggled. I was one of those kids. People said, Michael, you're stupid, you're lazy, you're not going to amount to anything. And for whatever reason, first year of high school, I had this fantastic teacher. He was 24 years old at the time. Mr. Byrne was his name. And many of you might relate to this. You might have that own special teacher in your life. But he just said to me, mate, you may not believe in yourself. I believe in you. And I think you've got more potential than you think you have. And if you're willing to sit down with me, spend your lunches, your recesses, work with me, I think you could be the top kid in the class by the end of the year. So I listened to him, and sure enough, he was right. I graduated from high school 4.5 years later, was top of the class, got into law school at UWA. And of course, some of you might also relate to this. You know, when you're down and out, there's no shortage of people saying how bad you are, how you won't amount to much. And then of course, when you do something well, suddenly everyone wants to be your friend, and they say, wow, you're really smart. You can do anything you want. And I always remembered getting into university, this conscious sense, an almost sense of gratitude being born here in WA, and remembering the difference that teacher made in my life, and being grateful for the opportunity he really gave to me. And it was really, you know, we always say never get tickets on yourself, right? Don't forget where you've come from. And for me, growing up here, that was something which I really understood. And as I got to learn more about the inequities around the world, the fact millions of children, through no fault of their own, may not have access to great teachers, may die before their 5th birthday because of the kind of stupid poverty where a child can't get vaccinated against an infectious disease despite them being available in our world, I thought, right, I want to contribute and give back in some way. And that's when I met the other founders of what would become Global Citizen whilst a university student here in WA. And the question we grappled with was, how could we build a movement of citizens to get involved in this endeavor to end extreme poverty? And if you remember back maybe 15, 20 years ago, today you will go to a conference, everyone will talk about AI, and the conference agenda will be AI for good, AI for bad, like is it gonna seal humanity's fate? Can it be used to address some of the biggest challenges of our time? Well, about 15, 20 years ago, if you went to a conference, that was the case with social media. And so what we did is we developed an app which would become the Global Citizen platform. You could download the app, you could learn about the issues, you could take quizzes, you could volunteer your time, you could contact your local elected officials. There was just one small problem, and that was that everyone, it seemed like, was developing apps at the time. And so the question we also grappled with was how to cut through the noise. And ultimately, that's where the Global Citizen platform we know today was born. A gentleman by the name of Ryan Gore, who I Skyped with back in start of 2011, he said, why don't you follow the route taken by Live Aid, but instead of charging people for tickets, give the tickets away for free in exchange for people downloading your app, volunteering their time, and in exchange giving them points, and they could trade in those points to earn a ticket to the festival. So many people don't realize this around the world, but the very first Global Citizen event that ever took place was actually in October 2011, right here in WA at the Belvoir Amphitheatre in the beautiful Swan Valley. And through a fluke, and it's documented in the book, and I won't go into the details here, and even that whole campaign could have been a book in and of itself. But through a 6-month period, we ended up convincing the musician John Legend to fly all the way to Perth, Australia. And he spent more time flying here from New York than he was actually here on the ground. And we had 5,000 people come along, and we had 25,000 people take action. And it was through that campaign that we got the attention of some foundations and folks in New York. And they said, why don't you bring that to America? And so we went over to America, and they said, you should do it in September because New York is beautiful. Do it here in this iconic city that once a year becomes the capital of the world, when it becomes the stomping ground of leaders during the UN General Assembly. There was just one challenge with that. We arrived in New York, and you might appreciate this story. We went around, we started meeting with people saying we wanted to do this music festival, we wanted to pull people together, and someone called us aside and they gave us advice. And they said, yeah, all that stuff you did in Australia, no one cares about that. If it didn't happen here in America, in fact, if it didn't happen in New York, it didn't happen at all. So forget that, get to the crunch. And we were fortunate that there was one band, Pearl Jam, and also Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters, who for whatever reason, they understood the model and loved it. But the thing everyone said is they said, you need an iconic venue. And so we found ourselves persuading the administration of Mayor Bloomberg at the time of New York City. And his administration agreed that for the first time since 1983, when Simon and Garfunkel performed on the Great Lawn of Central Park, that they would allow us to take the Great Lawn because they loved the fact that you could earn tickets for free in exchange for volunteering and citizenship. And so in September 2012, during my final year of university, I was literally submitting exams at 4 a.m. in the morning for civil procedure and all of that. I found myself on the Great Lawn for what would become the very first global citizen festival. And it was headlined by the great Neil Young and the Foo Fighters, and we had 60,000 people there. And so more than a decade and a half later, with some incredible projects, we've helped mobilize more than 40 million citizens to do everything from pick up trash at beaches to clean up parks, to volunteer for organizations like soup kitchens, to get engaged in meaningful advocacy on the biggest challenges of our time. And it's estimated, thanks to some help from pro bono impact study and analysis from PricewaterhouseCoopers, that those 40 plus million actions has helped unlock more than $40 billion through the help of our partners that have led to more than 1 billion life-saving interventions over the last decade and a half. And it's been my privilege as part of this movement to work with some incredible organizations and partners. And over that time, we've expanded globally. So we're now a movement today of 12.5 million global citizens. The goal is to take it to 50 million over the next half a decade. We're also building out Africa's first international touring circuit. One thing which I love about our work and our model at Global Citizen is we get to work with these incredible artists. But what I also love is working with artists from around the world, some of the emerging artists. And one thing I can tell you, the continent of Africa, which depending on who you ask is either seen as a basket case or it's seen as perhaps a place for just resources. It incredibly is this continent, the youngest population in the world, fastest growing. I think they estimate that by the middle of this century, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be of African descent. And incredibly, it's become, I think for the 3rd year running, the largest growing music market in the world by revenue. And this is a combination of the fact you have some of the biggest artists in the world coming from the continent. You also have the rise of digital platforms and streaming, which makes it incredibly affordable for people to download music. But one of the things it doesn't have is its own live events industry. Some of its biggest artists can tour around the world, but not on the continent. And so we've started to build that out. We've been looking at the policy, and I'll come back to the concept of policy entrepreneurship in a moment. Everything from copyright, because there's 40 countries that still don't have copyright law, and now with AI, what does that mean if a young artist in Nigeria or South Africa produces a song that isn't licensed, it can be used by someone else? Whereas if it's protected, as you have in Australia, through intellectual property regimes, they can earn a revenue from that income. It becomes taxable income from their societies. It's estimated that in the world of AI, the tourism, creative economy, music, and film could become one of the largest job generators in the world. It could become one of the areas in which we actually create jobs, not see jobs be destroyed by technology. So it's incredibly exciting. And we started this 2 years ago with the artist Kendrick Lamar in Rwanda. We trained the country's first rigging team, this 4-member elite squad. And if any of you know anything about the events industry, you know that rigging is the most dangerous, advanced, but also highly specialized qualification. And because of that, their arenas and stadiums are fully booked, and they're attracting some of the biggest events in the world, basketball, other forms of sport, other musician. Earlier this year, we took John Legend, and he actually made a comment. He said, I've been with Global Citizen for the last 15 years. I'm on their board. And 15 years ago, they even convinced me to go to this place, the Swan Valley of Australia. So you can see it left an impression, and we took him to Nigeria. And we're excited that next year we'll be expanding that to a new city. Next year as well, and give a little plug for my friends at the consulate here, and of course the Socceroos will be part of this as well, but the US together with Canada and Mexico are going to be co-hosting the FIFA World Cup in June and July. And it was a great honor when they took this up. They said, listen, And in Australia, like America, there's so many sports. But in America, there was a statistic that came out that when the US hosted the World Cup in 1994, apparently only 5% of the American population even knew it was taking place in the country, which may or may not be hard to believe, depending on who you ask. And so they said, we want to do something a little bit different this time and make sure people are actually aware of it. And so they asked if Global Citizen would produce the first ever halftime show of a FIFA World Cup, much like you have on the Super Bowl. But the difference is they wanted this to be for impact. They wanted it to be for good. And so we agreed. We just launched with FIFA the first ever FIFA Global Citizen Education Fund. And our goal between now and the middle of next year is to raise $100 million US. And this is for a combination of ticket donations, of project roundups, and we've already raised about 30 million. And the reason why I tell you this story is we're already making grants available to community organizations, grassroots organizations, non-profit organizations in the 48 countries that have qualified for the World Cup, which includes Australia. So if you know any community organizations, Rotary clubs or others, you could be eligible, or they could be eligible to apply for grants of up to $250,000, and we want to profile that in the lead up to the World Cup, and I have some details at the end on how you can register and find out more. And finally, just most recently, John mentioned I was in Brazil, and really we were in Brazil to bring the Global Citizen Festival to Latin America for the first ever time. We did it in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. And we were invited because a few years ago, some of the indigenous businesses in the Amazon reached out to us. And what they said is, the Amazon is vital to the world. It is the lungs of the planet. And they said, but without support, many of the communities there are often left with no choice but to cut down the forest or to engage in illegal gold mining. And they said, but with support, they can build these incredible sustainable businesses, ecotourism. They can also, it's where acai is from. That's originally where it came from. And I was telling a friend the other day about some of the best honey I've ever tasted comes from the stingless bees in the Amazon. And so we put together this campaign, and it resulted in this festival. Chris Martin from Coldplay curated it, and it was incredible. We mobilized partnerships worth $1 billion US, and just one example of those partnerships is, people don't know this, but in America, everyone talks about the beer craft industry in America. There's 15,000 craft breweries in America, many of them in the state of New York and upstate. But one of the fastest growing trends next to that is less well known is mead, honey wine. And so when I spoke to these communities with this incredible honey, I said, do you know much about mead? Have you ever thought about trying to get your honey into the mead market as a source of honey wine? And so one of the partnerships we announced of this campaign was we brought together in Virginia 5 honey wine meaderies, and they agreed to source, to make their mead, make their honey wine. They agreed to source that from the bees, the stingless bees and the beekeepers from the indigenous communities in the Amazon, and then donate some of the proceeds back. And we announced this at this incredible festival just 4 weeks ago in the heart of 60,000 people. It was this incredible, extraordinary event. The communities there were amazing, and some of Brazil's biggest artists. And so that's type of it. And the reason why I tell that story is, for Global Citizen, we've always been about partnership, and we've always believed, our team even today is no more than 70, 80 full-time people, based in different parts around the world. And I've always said, we know our strengths, but it's about working with the communities, those on the front lines, mobilizing, galvanizing support. That's what we do so well. And so the book, which I want to really give a shout out to Boffins, because Boffins has been incredible. They've supported this this book, and I always love supporting local bookstores. So if you want to buy it, don't go and purchase it on Amazon, and no offense to them because they're great, but I'll be happy to sign it outside. But the book isn't really, it's not about my story. It's not about the story of Global Citizen. It was my attempt, over many years to distill a practical guide from the incredible advocates, leaders that I've had the pleasure of working with, and to answer this question that kept on coming up from people, especially during the pandemic in recent years, much to my wife's chagrin. She says, I'm too generous with my time. And when we were starting Global Citizen here in Perth, there was a number of people, from my professors to teachers to a whole range of people who, for whatever reason, sat down and said, okay, you're a young person, but we're going to take a bet. You've got an idea. We're going to help you do it. And so I always say that if you email me or reach out on LinkedIn or social media, I will try and respond and help, because you never know where the next big idea is going to come from. And a lot of the questions people were asking me were, how can I help? How can I apply what you've done at Global Citizen to whatever challenge I'm dealing with in my local community, in my local school? Maybe it's dealing with something like illegal pollution in the local river, whatever the issue is. And I'll be honest, at first I wasn't sure how to answer that question. It reminded me of this experience, this memory from the first year of high school when, and I know this is blasphemy to say to many people, especially about sport, but being on the footy oval at school, and whereas all the other boys my age sat there with the oval saying, I want to score a winning goal, I remember just sat there thinking, I just want to kick this ball and have it go in the right direction, let alone score a goal. And of course I would overthink it, looking at all the kids viewing me, and I would kick the ball, something weird would happen, and it would fly off the other way, and all the other kids would laugh. And then we would go into a high school assembly, and without fail, the motivational speaker was always this great sporting legend. Maybe they won the Brownlow, gold medalist, and I remember thinking, that's all great, but I'm the kid who can't kick a football in the right direction, so I can't relate to this. And so the book was really my attempt to break it down. And I didn't want people to think you had to go out and create an organization to bring about change. It was really my attempt, whether you were in school, university, it's my belief that it is something we can all do. And it's not aiming to be comprehensive. It doesn't aim to address all the issues in the world, but it does aim to give people a start, a place to begin. When I first moved to America, and me being the politics nerd, and I'm humbled to be here and also with the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library, but from the same era, one of the first places I went to was Hyde Park, which is the home of Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR. And in the tourist shop there, I found this very cheaply made magnet. And to be honest, I have a feeling that the slogan was never actually said, because I've tried to look in the story, but it's a good slogan nonetheless, and I keep it on my fridge. And it was from the great Eleanor Roosevelt, who co-wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she said, the best way to begin is to begin. And so the book was my attempt to give people a place to begin. And the new chapter in the new paperback edition, and I've been thrilled with all of the feedback. Someone actually said to me that they read the book. Thank you. I appreciate that. And leave a review if you like as well. But one of the stories in the book, I talk about this concept of policy entrepreneurship. People not just inside government, and you can be inside government, but also outside government. And so the new chapter looks at people who aren't in government, whether it's entrepreneurs. This gentleman here is an entrepreneur from the UK, Greg Jackson, and his story, if you read it in the book, is how over 10 years in the UK, he took this small startup and he disrupted the energy market. And I won't tell you how he did it, only that the problem he sought to solve, and some of you might relate to this, but he would get the energy bills through the mail. And one time he noticed, because he was so busy, he said, I hadn't checked my energy bills, but he sat down over coffee one morning, went through the mail, and he opened up the energy bills, and he realized, hold on, my energy bill has doubled over the last few months. How did this happen? No explanation. So he said he rang the energy company, and the energy company said, oh, sorry, sir, thanks for pointing that out. Here, because you've rang and you've made a comment, we'll slash your energy bill in half for this month. Okay, that's weird, but he didn't think anything of it. A year goes by, opens up the energy bill, and he said it's back to where it was 12 months ago, and he rings again. And they say, okay, thank you, sir, we'll slash it. And he said, man, how dare they? He said, I'm asking for transparency. Can you tell me how you've calculated this? Can you tell me where this has come from? And he said, industry is lazy. And he said, if you're a working family, how do you have time to ring up? How do you have time to monitor this? And so he said, all of these energy companies were basically slagging people over the head with these bills with no transparency. And so he created this app. It was called Kraken, the technology platform. I think he was a big believer in Greek mythology or something. I don't know where the name came from. Maybe he thought he was going to slay the titans of energy. But basically the premise of the app was, if you tell people at different hours of the day what price the energy is, what they would apply, that people would respond to that. And they said, you never trust consumers, they never do that. And so he went ahead and he did it. And sure enough, in a few years, he took this little startup and he became the largest supplier of energy by household in the UK. And he said, there you go. You always trust citizens, so much so that he now has shaped policy. One of the ways he did it was knocking on people's doors and said, hey, I know you don't like this wind turbine in your backyard, but what about if we showed you how if you turn on your power at certain times, I will give you your energy bill for free at these times? And he said a lot of businesses come in and they want government handouts, but he said you have to be a policy taker before a policy shaper. And that's just one story which I share, and there's many others in the book, and not all of them are necessarily in energy, and not all of them are necessarily big companies. Some of them very small, some of them are grassroots advocates in South Africa, some of them are even trade union and coal workers and climate activists in Collie, Western Australia, and many parts of the world. I will just say, you know, right now people ask me what is the biggest challenge we face? And this graph here, which you probably can't see, but you can at least see the lines. Basically, in summary, it shows that every age group below the age of 55, but it's really across all age groups, but most acutely under the age of 24, has this sense of apathy. And the biggest thing is this question right now is, can our actions actually make a difference? And so, from my perspective, you know, the data shows, and what we've seen at Global Citizen, and I'll end on this note, and I'll just say, if you want to sign up to my newsletter, I'll put details in there about all the things I've mentioned, and I try and keep regularly in touch. But the data all shows, the mega studies all show that actually, yes, people might be apathetic, but there is a willingness to engage. People want to engage. And I told this story last night. I was reflecting, this memory came back to me earlier this week. So, and I'll finish with this story. I mentioned we have a 2-year-old daughter. So I started writing the book about just over 2 years ago. And shortly after writing it, we found out Wendy, my wife, was pregnant with our daughter, Mickey. And so people said, how long did it take you to write a book? I was like, pretty much 6 months, because everyone told us that our life was going to be over when our first child came. So there's no other deadline than to finish it. And they told us that, don't worry though, if you finish your book 2 weeks before, they said your first child never comes early, right? Turns out that was a lie, but we'll come back to that. So I finish this book, and it's 7 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday. I've just pulled all these all-nighters, and our baby's not due for another 2 weeks, so Wendy and I have all these plans. We're going to go out and see a Broadway show. Everyone says, okay, life's over, let's go and do all these things, cram them in. We're here in New York City, so let's go and do that. And I get a phone call from my mum, and my mum, so I grew up in Kinross, just north of Joondalup, and my mum still works. She's worked there pretty much my whole life there's an aged care facility, and she works with elderly people with dementia, with Alzheimer's, and others who just need a helping hand. And she said, do you remember this gentleman called Len? My mind went back to 20 odd years ago when I was that kid at high school in the northern suburbs when, didn't have many friends, struggled with low self-esteem, all of this stuff. I would get home from school and I would walk my dog down to the local park. And there was always this elderly gentleman there. He had a Cockney accent because he grew up in the UK and he moved to Australia during his retirement. He had these 2 walking sticks. And I'll never forget his dog because it looked like the dog from Lady and the Tramp. And indeed, the dog was actually called Tramp with his wily grey hair. And I said to Mum, I remember that Len, but surely that can't be the same guy. And she goes, yeah, he's 105 years old and he remembers you and he wants to speak to you. So there we are on FaceTime. She gives it to Len. And Len tells me that he was born in 1917. He got married on Remembrance Day in 1939. And the following year, in 1940, when war broke out in Europe, he found himself as a British soldier in France. And he said when the German war machine took over the country and France was falling and they were told to evacuate, he said, I don't know what happened, but I couldn't find my unit. And he said, so I saw this hill and I started climbing above the hill. And as I was climbing, I was looking at the grass, a great shadow came above. And he said he looked up expecting to see a cloud, but it was 200 German warplanes blocking out every inch of the sky. And he said, I thought, Michael, that was it. I was a goner. So he said, I just remember standing there like a stick on a tree and hoping they'd fly over, which they did. And then once they had gone, he said he ran around the corner and he said it was this abandoned village. And he said he saw an American car there and he said, you beauty. And he got in the car and he drove to the coast. And he said, I was on the last boat leaving the port of Calais before it fell. When he arrived in England, his commanding officer said, Len, I need you to take this gun. You're the only man I can spare. Go to that village, rally the home guard, get them out, pitchforks and everything. And he said, and I went and did that, and sure enough, the enemy was parachuting above into the town, and we ran down the hill to meet them. And I just remember saying to him as we're on this iPhone, I said, Len, wow, did you ever think it was over, at that moment? How did you maintain hope? How did you think your actions could matter? Could they make a difference? And he said something to me, which I've never forgotten, and I still remember the way he said it. He said, no. We kept saying to ourselves, we haven't got much, but we're not running away. We'll give it a go. We're not running away. We'll give it a go. Well, a few weeks after he told that story, our daughter Mickey turned out, again, people said they never come early. Mickey came 10 days early, so there you go. She was born, and a few weeks after that, I got a phone call from my mum saying that it was Len's 106th birthday the previous day, and his daughter had come in and said to him, happy birthday. And he said, I haven't got anything left to give. It's up to others to give it a go. And that night, up in the northern suburbs, he passed away. And I thought of that because 2 days ago, I was sent a photo from my mum, and Mickey was standing pretty much in the room where Len had FaceTimed me when we finished the book. And I remember those words, "We haven't got much, but we're not running away. Let's give it a go." And I think we'd all agree we've got far more at our disposal than any previous generation. I genuinely believe if you ever wanted to live a profoundly meaningful life, now is the time to do it. Because of our actions today, people born 5, 10, 15 years from now will be impacted as a result. And it's the stories in the book, it's that practical guide point, an 8-point plan. That if something comes from it, the agency, from apathy to agency, from ideas to impact, from talk to action, that's what I think we can all do to honor those memory and to look to a better future. And so I want to thank you all for having me today, and let's give it a go. Thank you.
Okay. Turn it on.
That's fantastic, Michael. That was terrific. So, and it was not quite what I was expecting, because I've been boning up on the book because I actually read the book earlier today. So I was going to ask all these questions about the book, but actually, three-quarters of what Michael was talking about actually was more about this amazing organisation that you helped get to co-found. So, just before I ask you a bit more about the book, in terms of the organisation, I mean, obviously you're raising money and doing things. Are there particular areas that you try to get into in terms of climate change, is it poverty? I know from reading this, you've obviously got a couple of ideas, some areas that you really focus on. So, are there areas you focus on, and how do you decide what you focus on?
Yeah, so with my global citizen hat on, I always think it's important. We have this movement of 12, or community of 12.5 million citizens, and we ask them what's important to them, and we have a regular feedback loop. And one of the things that comes up again and again is the anxiety around jobs. And I think, we live in a world of AI, we live in a world of disruptive technology. I think perhaps one of the reasons for those statistics earlier today, and I saw this on the book tour, again and again, I would go to some of the top universities in America, Harvard and others, and I would meet people, quite frankly, who were probably living in the top 1% of the country, and they were very anxious about whether or not they could get a job, whether or not they could get a career. And we know from the research that when it comes to ending extreme poverty, yes, you need health, yes, you need education, yes, you need access to sanitation, all of these things. But ultimately, one of the great levelers that will lift communities out of poverty in the long term is jobs. And from a public policy perspective, one of the biggest challenges we face over the next decade is the fact that about 1.2 billion people are going to enter the job market. And according to the World Bank, there's only about 400 million jobs projected to be created. And that was before you add in AI and everything else. And so that's why, from my perspective, I'm very passionate about what are the new industries that could create jobs, whether that's tourism, the live events industry, Indigenous-owned businesses that we're seeing in the Amazon, or in the energy sector. And one of the more hopeful stories I just came from, so I was in South Africa a few weeks ago, and I went to this solar academy, and I met these two young guys, Luke and Keanu. And I said to them, okay, you're going to train, you can build solar panels, you can maintain them, but what are you hoping for? Because this is a country with 60% unemployed youth. It's got one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world. And they said, well, we're not planning for a job. And they said, we know you're from Perth, Australia. We've read about rooftop solar. And they said, we're going to start our own business. We're going to go to all of our neighbors who keep on complaining about the unreliable electricity, and we're going to convince them to allow us to install rooftop solar and show them that they'll earn back the money in 5 years. I said, okay, that's quite the ambition. And then they said, then we're going to go to the American tech companies. We're going to convince them to build data centers, because they said we have some of the best places for solar in the world, and we're going to show them how we can build the energy to power that. And then they said, and then we're not done. Because I said, well, that's ambitious. And they said, and then we're going to go to space, and we're going to build the solar panels in space that's going to bring humanity back to the moon. And I thought, wow, that's ambitious. And so I tell that story because for me it's important to maintain hope, and the pathways will be different. It's not going to be the same manufacturing industries, agriculture that's lifted communities out of poverty in the past. It will take work, and one of the things, I know we're in a university, outside of Global Citizen, my wife and I, we also run our own business, and right now we've been working with some partners on the university sector. And we've been looking at new learning models because there are jobs out there, but some of the biggest companies will complain that they can't find young people with the right skills. And so we've been looking at how we address that skills industry mismatch as well. So that's probably the big challenge, because I think if you can address that, then everything else could fall into place.
One of the things you quote in the book, and I've heard about it before, is and I think it would be applicable to global citizens, the 3.5% rule.
Yeah.
Can you maybe explain about that? And do you sort of see, in a sense, see yourself and your organisation, if you like, as part of that 3.5% rule?
Yeah, so the 3.5% rule, and I talk about it in the book. One of the things I talk about the steps of how you bring about change. One of them is the art of timing and this concept of the Overton window, right? What are the acceptable policies that's going to be acceptable to society in order to translate and get adopted? But here's the thing, most people assume that you need 50% or more of the population. But there was this big study done of all of the big social movements in history, many of the big changes that have taken place. And what they found is that every movement with at least 3.5% of the population behind it in a visible way was successful. And so that's the 3.5% rule. And I think to your point on Global Citizen, this is why we have this ambition to grow to 50 million is I meet a lot of nonprofit organizations doing incredible work, and then they get into rooms and it's just their own friends and family. And what I tell our team again and again is we have to go out. We have to meet people where they are. And if that's through music, if that's through sports, and I realized the irony of me saying that because I was the kid who couldn't kick a football in the straight line, and now here I am partnering with FIFA, and also with events. I wasn't particularly great at organizing events, but that's what we have to do. I think we always say at Global Citizen that our mantra is pop and policy. Yes, it's public policy, but it's also popular culture as well.
Okay, one more question from me, and then I'll open to the floor. I think I first knew about what you were working on years ago, and you mentioned the book a few times, which was about polio eradication, because they have, and you can maybe tell the story briefly about how West Australia was also sort of part of that when Julie Gillard and the Commonwealth came here, I think it was. So a little bit about the story, and also where is the world at in eradicating polio?
Yeah, so this goes back to the story. Many people say, well, what was the story? And I was trying to compress it in the truncated time, but people say, well, what was the story of the first concert you did at the Swan Valley? And people might remember it was the last time the Queen came, and I was explaining to my wife yesterday that when the Queen last came to Australia, the late Queen, in October 2011, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, you might remember that it was billed as Australia's biggest sausage sizzle, I think, on the Esplanade. And if you wanted to see the Queen, you could go down, get a sausage sizzle, and you could go and see her. But there was another event that was organised that same day, and that's what we organised in the Swan Valley. And how that came about is when we had this idea of doing this event here, trialing it, we decided we needed a cause to show what was possible. And people said at the time, poverty is too abstract, it's too big, choose something that's specific, people can get their heads around. And it was actually a Rotarian, David Goldstone, and actually he won one of the Curtin medals that you guys give to humanitarians. So there's a connection here to this university. And he had founded a Rotary Club, and he told me at the time, he said, there's one cause that you should do. And he said, Rotary International is a community-based organization founded in Chicago, now with chapters around the world. Thanks to their incredible generosity, they had helped in my lifetime alone reduced the spread of polio by 99.9%. And he said the first time the Queen had come to Perth in the 50s, apparently she had to stay on a boat off the Swan River because there was a big polio endemic that had broken out. In fact, again, I saw Beasley Drive on the drive up here, and Kim Beasley got polio as a child during that same outbreak. And it was a huge thing. And he said, how amazing would it be? He said, these summits, these Commonwealth heads of government meetings, they generally end up being talk fests, right? And he said, how amazing would it be if right here in Perth, you got leaders to commit the resources to end polio once and for all? And he said, I have beef with the Australian government because he said Rotarians have given so much money, and yet the Australian government discontinued funding at the time a decade earlier. And he said, so we should get the government to renew. And so I thought this was great. Of the 4 countries that was polio endemic at the time, 3 of them were from the Commonwealth. So we got down, we wrote out this letter, and I remember together with David, bashed it into shape. Julia Gillard was Prime Minister at the time. And basically we were saying, listen, there's one cause we want you to take up. We want you to commit $50 million, get all the other leaders to commit, so it's $100 million. Let this be the legacy of Choggum Perth 2011. And, you know, you send a letter off, you don't expect to get a response. And so, like David here, I was like at university, fairly active, and one of the members of parliament came in. And I stood between her and the exit and made sure that she wasn't leaving that room without a copy of my letter to the Prime Minister. And she agreed to take it to her. And again, I thought she was being polite. And about a week later, I was getting a coffee at the ref at UWA. And I get this phone call from a blocked number, and it was Julia Gillard's office. And they said, Prime Minister's going to be in Freo next week. She's going to be making this announcement. She has about 10 minutes before that. How would you like 10 minutes with her to discuss your letter? And so I thought, well, I'm not going to say no to that. So I go down, wait for Prime Minister. She was given some interview, and then I go in and meet her. And I was so lost for words because she was looking me in the eye. Julia Gillard's very impressive, and everyone who meets her says that she has this way in which she looks you directly in the eye, and she gives you respect, and she makes you feel like you're the most important person in the world at that moment. But to me, it was very unnerving, and I kind of fumbled what I was trying to say. And she just turned around and said, Michael, I'll be honest with you, I'm on my 3rd shot of Red Bull for the evening, so if you don't mind, get on with it. And so I just stumbled it and said, okay, I want you to put polio on the agenda, commit $50 million, and make this the turning point in the effort to eradicate polio. And she said, I'm very interested in that, but I need some help. And I thought, what do you mean some help? You're the Prime Minister. And she said, you know, politicians can't click their fingers and make decisions. You need to give us permission to spend what is in the end your money. And so, to be honest, up until that point, we hadn't settled on a concert. I just said, okay, what about if we did this big concert? I don't even know where the concert came from. I just stumbled over it and I said, if we did this concert, got all these people together, rallied, showed public support the day before Choggum, as all these world leaders flew in, would that work? And she said, if you can do that, we've got a deal. And I walked out there, shook hands, and then I thought, oh dear. The most I'd really organised up to that point was a sausage sizzle. I was president of a social club at UWA, and it didn't go particularly well. People came along, there was 50 cold sausages on the barbecue, and they all promptly walked off. Fortunately, and I document this in the book, you know, I'm a firm believer that if you can put out ideas and be very clear on the impact you can achieve, people are looking for solutions. And more often than not, people are willing to help if you can be specific and get to the point. And so, sure enough, one thing led to another. And 6 months later, we were standing for that event. And Julia Gillard Still remember the press conference. She invited us. We had the polio survivors. We had David from Rotary. And she, together with all of these other leaders, they committed $118 million. And I can say this today with just 39 cases of polio since the end of the year. And touch wood, we're on the brink of making it just the second human disease in history to be eradicated. That people at the World Health Organization, UNICEF, US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, all of these big institutions, they still point to Perth as the turning point, because before that it was more than 1,000 cases and it hasn't been that high since. And that was the legacy of, if you're wondering, Perth Chogham 2011.
Great. So on that point, how about we have time for a few questions, not too many, but just a few, and then we'll go outside and you can buy the book and get that to sign. So, and as I said before, when you ask your question, pretend you're in the United Nations, press the little button, bring the microphone up, and that way we can hear better. The green button, that's it.
Green button. There we go. You can hear me now. Thank you. Fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. You've done incredible things, seemingly almost by accident, which is just brilliant. And what you're talking about seems very zeitgeisty to me. I don't know if you're familiar with the BBC Reef Lectures, but it's Rutger Bregman that's giving them this year. And he talked about the idea of, very much from the abolitionist sort of movement, that it's time for another moral crusade. We've done technological crusades, we've done economic crusades, we've done social crusades, and now it's really time for a moral crusade. And that's how he sort of frames it. And then you see Gov Zero come up and the Gen Z movements in other nations. So there seems to be, as I say, this zeitgeisty thing. And you talk about partnerships. I'm just wondering how you coordinating what seems to be a really lively cultural bubbling at the moment, especially when, as your book says, we're in a very divided world where it's not so much adversarial anymore, it's more of hatred and blame. Yeah. So divided world, lots of bubbling. How do you coordinate that? No pressure.
You know, I've always believed, and I'd say this to our team, you know, the moments of anxiety, and there's been so many disruptions in the last 10 years, seemingly. And I've always said, and this is what people in turn told me, that we can't control the actions of every single actor in the world, but we can control how we react to it. And one example of this was early on in the pandemic 5 years ago. So my wife and I, we was living in New York. We had just moved in together and we were in Brooklyn. And it was at that moment, I'm not sure if you remember, but New York City was ground zero. And it was frightening stuff. I had people messaging me around the world. I still remember my dad here in Perth saying, Michael, like, get out of there, come here. But of course, we had just met. And it really felt like in Brooklyn, it was one of those moments. I remember opening the door, looking to the neighbors, and it was like that scene from Independence Day or something where they were loading their car and driving upstate to get out. And everyone was panicking. And I remember at the time that we were also panicking because there we were known for doing these big events. And we had actually been planning to mark the 35th anniversary since Live Aid with this big 8-city extravaganza where we were going to have 8 cities around the world. We were going to do 10 years until the conclusion of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to end extreme poverty. We was going to do this big bang. And I remember 3 things happened that day. It was a Saturday in early March. The first was that I got a phone call from my other co-founder who was walloping the fact that this was all falling over and we as an org might go extinct because for a group known for bringing people together, how do you react? And he goes, I felt like my whole, and some people will know him, so you find this funny, but he said, I felt like my whole life was leading up to this moment and now it's all effed. So that was one response. The second response is, later that day, we got on the phone call with Universal Music and some of the others, and they said, well, artists want to do something. And now you might say it was obvious. At the time, all of the TV stations had no original content because they couldn't produce. And so we said, well, what about if we just got people, artists, to record a song and contribute it? We could pull together this show. And we pulled together this event, and the first phone call that day was with Lady Gaga. and she had just won the Oscar for When a Star is Born, and she said, I feel like we should do something, and her team, and she came to us because she didn't know who else to go to, and we ended up getting about 100 singers to come on board and commit their time. And the third thing that happened that day was I sat down and I started getting aches in my feet, and of course I was in the first probably 1 million people in the world when they were still tracking to get COVID. Certainly most people and friends and family were like, they didn't know anyone, so they thought I was going to die. And I had colleagues the next day saying, let's just send a prayer for Michael right now. And again, at the time, that's how scary it was. And 4 weeks later, when we got through that, locked in home, we had over 100 artists around the world, everyone from Elton John, Coldplay, Chris Martin, Lady Gaga. We managed to mobilize. We didn't focus on governments because it was a scary time, so we went to companies, something like $127 million for PPE, immediate relief, whatever we could do. And I still remember we got on this call with our team, and they said, it gave us something to focus on because we were all scared, and it gave us something that we could do. And of course, it didn't take away the fear, but it was something that we could do and not worry about. And I opened the book, and I'm happy to chat more about this, but I opened the book. People said, okay, you dedicated it to your daughter, but I also dedicated it to my 91-year-old grandma. And in the quote, I made it less morbid. I paraphrased her, but the Phil quote that she used to say to me, and my dad is a big worrier, and I probably take it from him, and my grandma used to say, oh, Michael, why are you worrying? You die if you worry, you die if you don't, so why worry at all? And of course, we all worry, but the key is that I found is to focus on what we can do. And I think right now that's the message to our team, and again, and we did that again earlier this year, and we're doing it again next year as well.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? Sure.
Hi, my name is Clinton Jordan, IP mentor. I help people deal with ideas. A while ago, I met a guy who spent a bunch of time in Ghana. You mentioned Africa as a basket case.
Can you use the...
Yeah, just push it close to you, that's it. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned Africa as being a basket case, which I happen to agree with. It's certainly something that needs global focus in how we can help, particularly the kingdom part of Africa. Say Ghana, for example, has got a whole bunch of kingdoms. They've got a lot of wealth that the average people can get to, but no easy way for them to turn, say, gold that they can pick up out of the river, turn that into cash. I spent a week trying to figure out how to do it, and I got to a roadblock, which was anyone who tries to do anything in these areas, as soon as they establish something, they have gangs that just come and take everything. So hence Africa as a basket case. Is this something that Global Citizen might be interested in?
So I think because there's a few things to unpack there. The thing I think we're entering this new era where, part of the reason that keeps me optimistic is, yes, we're divided, yes, we're fragmented, but we're now entering this era where I think maybe in part because of that fragmentation, no one single actor or stakeholder can determine the outcome of things. And I think what we're likely to see is new coalitions of the willing amongst different types of partners come together. And in part, I mentioned our work in the Amazon rainforest. I mentioned working with indigenous communities. I still remember 4 years ago, the reason how that came about is some indigenous communities found us on LinkedIn, and we think indigenous communities, you may not imagine this, but if you go to the rainforest actually has a population, if it was a country, it would be bigger than Australia in its own right. And you go there, and my first impression wasn't what I was expecting, because they took me to a nightclub with these indigenous DJs, incredible music, incredible food, some of the best food I've had in the world. But because of the access, they reached out to us and they said, listen, we're having trouble getting these governors to agree to us to take up our cause and to protect and invest. If you guys as a group with all your citizens around the world and your musicians, they said Coldplay is massive in Brazil. You're the charity partner of Coldplay. They're about to perform in Rio and Sao Paulo. They said, if you just directed some of that attention onto this. And so we started sending social media messages to the governors saying, hey, you're going to reply to these groups' letters over here. And sure enough, these governors, and you can, I think it was Paul Keaton who said, never doubt the horse of self-interest. Indeed, it's the horse that's always won. So we made sure there wasn't just a stick. We made sure there was the carrot for these governors. We said, hey, if you meet with these groups and do what they're asking, we'll bring you to New York. You can stand on stage at our festival and we'll have everyone applaud you for being a hero. And you can imagine within hours, we had these governors replying to us and acknowledging that. And the reason why I tell that story is I think alongside apathy, and this goes to the question earlier, in the book, one of the steps I talk about is pragmatic idealism. I think one of the biggest barriers right now is the inability to recognize sometimes that working for change requires working with people we don't always like or agree with on everything. And again, the book, it's not about my experience. There's one story in there, but more or less it's about distilling these 8 practical guides from these incredible examples from all parts of the world, all different aspects of society around what they found worked. And there was one common denominator that was common to all of them. And they all said, the only way we broke a change was recognizing you have to work with those you don't like or agree with. And the good news is in parts of Africa, when I look at those stories of Luke and Keanu, and a city like Johannesburg, yes, it has big youth unemployment rate. It also, and I know I had my phone whipped out of my hand, so I saw crime firsthand. But at the same time, the thing that I'm optimistic about is you take something like state corruption. Well, now because of technology like solar and battery and with the right policy, you've got people leapfrogging that. And in the last few years, a few years ago, the power in South Africa was going out all the time. Now it's not, but it's not, and I say this with the greatest respect to government and others, it's because people, households, businesses just took matters into their own hand and started pioneering it themselves. And so I think we're going to see more of that. I think it's going to require different types of partnership with willing folks in government, with willing folks in civil society, with willing folks in businesses, in students. But there is a way there, and that's why I call it policy entrepreneurship, because it is going to be different ways of working, but it is going to require us to move beyond the type of tribalism which I've seen, and I've seen this even in New York the last few years, where people hold you back and you say, why are you being held back? And often it's because of a fear that if I speak to this person or if I work with that person, someone from my tribe, my own side, is going to out me as a traitor and is going to call that. And I think if you go to America, more than 3/4 of Americans want to connect with one another. They want to work with their neighbors, and yet only 17% know how to do that or are willing to do that. And one of the things that gives me faith, one of my favorite reports is the World Happiness Report. And there's this question, a 2-part question that comes out in the World Happiness Report. First question it says is, if someone in front of you dropped their wallet, would you pick it up and give it back to them? And most of us in the room, and of course, if you're going to say no, you're probably not going to admit that here, but most of us would say, yes, I'd pick up the wallet and give it back to the person. And yet, when we're asked the second question, and most people say yes to that, you would pick it up. We're asked the second question, if it was you who dropped your wallet, do you believe someone else would pick it up and return it to you? Most of us say no. So we're actually more apathetic, arguably, than is the reality of human nature. And so that's why a big part of what we do and what I believe in what with the book is that kind of coalition building at all different levels, because I think if we can do that, we can do a lot of good in the world. And that was one message from the likes of Jane Goodall and others, all the way through to advocates, again, in South Africa and others. That was something that they appreciated again and again.
On that note, I think we might call it a day because it's already 5:45. There's books to be sold and signed and food and drinks to be consumed. So can I say on behalf of everybody, Michael, thank you so much. It's been a tour. Thank you. And so, as I mentioned, it's the last curtain corner for the year. We have filmed this, so if you've got friends who want to see it, just tell them to go to the website. Thank you very much to Sarah, who's out there, who's been doing a lot of the work over the last year in terms of organising us, and we'll see you again probably late February, early March next year. So thanks very much for coming, and we'll see you outside. Good night.